Hello, welcome to another little webinar. In this one, I am going to talk about one way that I at least do my best to teach writing responsibly in my AP English class. But these strategies could certainly be used in any class, in any grade where students are producing a lot of writing. In AP English, students do a lot of timed writings, and what I have found over the years is that a timed writing on occasion should just be take it and move on because there's so many of them, but students grow so much when I take the time to point out a key lever or one aspect of their writing that could really improve, that would make their writing just exponentially better the next time around. So I'm going to kind of talk you through the process I used in the last writing timed assignment that I did and talk through some of the differentiated responsive things that I did with the aftermath of that. So this was the student's prompt. We read the short story Hills Like White Elephants together. So this wasn't a true cold timed writing. Students were very, very prepared to write on this topic. And my students have also had a lot of experience already with our rubric, so that's pretty clear to them, and we'll see how that comes into play later. But you'll see that students were supposed to use all of these myriad devices, or any of those myriad devices, but most importantly to characterize the couple's experience. And that's crucial. Students must answer that portion of the question. So I give out the timed writing, students work. Afterwards, I collect back all 28 of their lengthy writings, and I think, okay, what do I do? Well, when I go to approach looking at their writing, I kind of want to keep a hierarchical order in my mind of what we're going to prioritize fixing in what order. So revisions of understanding the passage or the prompt are most important. And in this case, the students should all have understood the passage because we did go through it together. But they really needed to make sure that they also understood the prompt and answered the prompt. Next step, you want to make sure students have a proper controlling idea or thesis. And then evidence is next most important, and then explanation, and then so on. I would leave editing things for last or for another time and space, potentially flipped classroom model, can I send things home, can I do one-offs, etc. So what I'm going to do is basically sit down and read through a whole big sampling of essays. I'm probably going to read 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10 essays beginning to end. While I'm reading these essays beginning to end, I'm thinking about that hierarchical, oh gosh, what do we need to fix first? And now in AP Lit, it's probably going to be more nuanced because students really come ready to write thesis statements and embed their evidence. So there might be something more nuanced that I need to think about. But I read through these without stopping. I might make a few notes, mostly for my own benefit, not necessarily for student feedback. And once I've read a big sampling, then I kind of start to think through that hierarchy in a handful of targeted essays. So you'll notice that in this particular essay, I made notes. Again, these are more to myself than they are to the student, although hopefully they're helpful to the student too. I noticed that this student was picking evidence well and using, oh, beautiful student language, but still answering the question about the couple's relationship. However, when I actually dug into this, it almost started to seem like this student maybe had a misread of the passage after all. So that becomes priority one. I'm going to put this essay to the side, and maybe there are other essays that also have misreads, so I can group them together. But this student's essay becomes a priority, and I'm going to kind of put it off to the side with a post-it note on it, and that becomes an actual conference rather than written feedback to that student. Oh gosh, this person thinks that these individuals are comfortable together, and that's like the opposite of what's happening in this story, so I need to pull her and talk to her about that right away. With other students, I kind of eventually begin to notice patterns. So I noticed for these that Some students just didn't have enough explanation or enough evidence selected. They did select some evidence, it was fine, their explanation was accurate, but they just needed more of it to have a fuller essay. So I'm going to put all of those students' essays that fall into that key lever kind of into a pile with a sticky note on top. Same goes, I had a whole bunch of students who write very, very beautifully and fluently end up scoring 4s because their essay was partial, language right off the rubric, because they didn't finish. They wrote lovely first body paragraphs about the first half of the passage and then some amount of a second body paragraph and then ran out of time. So I'm actually going to pull this, and I wrote the word partial in quotes to remind myself to have students pull out the rubric and look at the language of the 4 and self-reflect, not have me tell them their essays are partial and that's why it's a 4, but to look at their essays, look at the rubric, and determine the word that reinforces why they score a 4. This other group of students needs to better connect the methods to the relationship. So I had a lot of students talk about Jig / the girl and the American, but not necessarily them together in their relationship, which is really what the prompt was asking. So that's another group of students. Lastly, some students wrote full essays. They were quality, they connected method to meaning, they really delved into what was happening in the scene and the experience. And so they're going to have some extension work tomorrow where they better connect to theme and so what to take those 6s and move them to 7s and beyond. So once I've kind of stacked these essays together with Post-its on top, then I'm going to kind of also look at specific student writing because I'm actually going to turn this into conferences with students. Now I could give them handwritten feedback, but it's actually, in my experience, more helpful if you're going to do full revisions with essays to, instead of giving handwritten feedback that can get lost in translation, give students that feedback live, one-on-one, or 3 students together all can work on connecting the method to the relationship better. I'm going to pull all 3, talk to them about it, and conference right there and right then. I might make some notes for myself, again, like, okay, this was going well, but they have to talk more about the relationship, and that's just reinforcing what I want to talk about in these groups. When I come into class tomorrow, I'm going to set each group up with some sort of lesson or reflection or model and purposeful revisions so that they're all working on their revisions and I can float to different groups and coach on what they particularly need to work on. I can also pull individual conferences like this student. This student kind of missed the boat on writing a full thesis. He didn't get specific about what literary devices Hemingway uses, and there's just some confusing language here. The deteriorating state in the relationship and the American tourist, okay, but then it kind of leaves the thesis behind to talk about how they're in a foreign country and la la la, and doesn't ever connect to so what. He's the only student in my class who didn't list specific literary devices, and not to single one out, because actually the rest of the essay says some really lovely things about, like, she's bringing this innocence, her baby, into a world of corruption. Juan, that's really smart. But imagine how much better it would be if you had just pointed out some of the methods, then you could then recycle and force yourself to come to method later in this essay. So after my misread conference, Juan's going to be my second conference of the day, and I'm going to pull him one-on-one and make sure he really understands the components of a thesis statement. As in, I'm going to talk to him about it, have him take notes on it, and have him practice live in front of me while I'm watching. I'm also made myself, again, a note that Brian wrote an exemplary introduction and thesis statement that should be helpful to pull while we're doing this conference. So I'm just going to lean over, grab Brian's paper, and bring it to the table while I'm talking to Juan about thesis. This conference with Juan about thesis should take 5-ish minutes, and the conference about the misread might also take 5 minutes, and those are longer. Maybe it'll take 10 minutes to really explain to Juan the importance of the thesis statement. But that doesn't leave as much time for the other groups, which is why I want all the people working on theme together, sitting in a group, working on theme in a productive way, and revising accordingly. One last thing I want to say about teaching writing responsively, and this is just something that I do. You might have your own practices, but you might have noticed in one of these pictures that my laptop is in the background here. While I'm sorting through all these papers and thinking about them, I'm taking notes on my laptop. Sometimes I literally type up student essays or examples as I'm going so that I have them. I almost never write my own models now, whether they're examples or non-examples. I just pull straight from student papers. But I also make really quick notes to myself about what the lesson might look like when I'm responding to their writing. So for example, I had a bunch of kids make interesting spelling errors, and I was just thinking, hey, I want to pull a channel from Reading Intervention and have them make spelling practice on index cards that they have to practice 3 days in a row. That was just like a quick note. And then I noticed a huge trend that no one in my whole class wrote up at the end of the story. Like, what do they do after the story ends? Do they go to Madrid? Do they not go to Madrid? Do they break up? Do they stay together? Whatever. So I decided, hey, let's do a quick activity tomorrow to get them thinking, make sure they use evidence. I'm going to have them reread the end of the story and do a 4 corners of what students think happens at the end of the story. Then I'll use that information in that great, rich discussion that happens and turn that into, hey, talking about what happens at the end of the story or the end of the passage, in the case of a timed writing, needs to be a part of your essay. You can't just leave out the end. So I'll turn that into a quick lesson about the end of their essays, their conclusions. That's going to apply to everyone across the board, and that's how I'm going to start class. You'll notice that I had these grandiose dreams about reading literary criticism and then decided not to. I also make notes for myself about students that I need to highlight publicly for doing something really well. Students just don't get enough positive praise throughout the day, and it's so crucial to just remind myself before I even want to dive into, oh my god, no one talked about the end of the story and here are all the spelling mistakes, to remind myself that I want to highlight Brian. I'm literally going to have Brian stand up and read his opening to the whole class because it was just brilliant. And making a note to myself to photocopy Oscar's essay because it was the exemplar and that's faster than my typing it. Lastly, I keep a running tally on all of my timed writings, and I have this kind of in different places, but students who need grammar lessons, it's kind of different, but I'm starting to notice patterns. And I keep track of this information so that I can use what I'm currently using, thanks to Samantha Merritt, huge shout out Samantha, is No Red Ink, which is a cool website that lets you send kind of specific practices to students in your class. So I can send practice on comma splices to Marlon and Alondra and Priscilla, and it's digital, it's on the internet. But maybe during class tomorrow they'll have time to work on something like this. You can do it on an iPhone. So public service announcement, make sure you're allowed to let students use iPhones in class. I do all the time for things like this, and it's really, really helpful. Or I can send it home with them as well. I also notice, because Marlon's name comes up in a bunch of different places, that she's someone that's going to need to come and work with me one-on-one to better understand kind of the rules of standardized English. She's a great hard worker, and I know that it's just not coming naturally to her, so I'm going to work with her more one-on-one. I also really did make spelling flashcards for all of these words that these students missed, and so far it seems to be working pretty well. But like I said, this is kind of a running tally that's always in flux, and I am not going to stop class to teach possessive apostrophes lesson to 28 kids when only 3 students are making possessive apostrophe mistakes in their use of standardized English. So I'm going to respond to the needs of Veronica, Marlon, and Angelica, and hopefully expedite the class for the rest of the lesson. This is really brief crash course, and it is certainly not the only way to teach writing responsively, but I've found that it's really helpful to take a timed writing and then turn it immediately back around with live feedback and live practice rather than writing all over it. Saves you time at home. This kind of planning took me an hour, and it would have taken me much, much, much longer to provide handwritten feedback to all 28 kids. Hopefully this is helpful, and I look forward to hearing more from all of you about how you're teaching writing responsibly in your classes.